Got it.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Wong. I'm the Vice President of the San Francisco chapter of Veterans for Peace. I'm also the co-chair of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group and a co-founder of the organization Pivot to Peace, which is a coalition of the Chinese community and the peace community. Today, our guest on our channel is Ray McGovern. He's a former Central Intelligence Agency officer turned political activist. McGovern was a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, and in the 80s chaired the National Intelligence Estimates and prepared the president's daily brief. He received the Intelligence Commendation Medal at his retirement, and he returned it in 2006 to protest CIA's involvement in torture. McGovern's post-retirement work includes commenting for the Consortium News, RT, Sputnik News, and other outlets on intelligence and foreign policy issues. He co-founded Veteran Intelligent Professionals for Sanity, and he's also on the advisory board of Veterans for Peace. Ray McGovern, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be able to share some views with you, some news about Ukraine, Russia, China. You know more about China than I do, so I hope that you'll feel free to chip in anytime you think it's appropriate. I'm not sure how many of our audience are familiar with the kind of Russian history that bears on the problems now with respect to NATO and with respect to China. It's not much of a history, actually. It only goes back to about the 9th century, if you can believe it. Now, by US terms, that's a long way, but where you compare that with some of the ancient civilizations like Persia or China, or if even Egypt and so forth, that's not so long. Why do I mention that? Well, I mention that because Russia was born in Kiev.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Up until, well, what happened was the Vikings had a really lucrative trade route through the Russian rivers, down through Kiev into Byzantium, right? Where there were all kinds of riches that they could take back and sell. And the knyaz, the prince of Kiev, got pretty wealthy, and so did a lot of the people in Kiev, and they were also extremely intelligent people. They had an oral tradition that rivals Homer, for God's sake, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. There was one epic poem, Slovo o polku Igorevye. Those of you who have studied Russian history would know it. It's an incredibly gifted poem. Now, but the problem was they didn't have how do I say it? They didn't have any way to write it down. What do I mean? They didn't have any written language. Okay, we're talking 8th century, 9th century after Christ, right? AD, as we used to say, right? So what happened? Well, as they become known throughout the world, there were 2 Greek priests went up to Kiev, okay? And they said, this is a terrific civilization. Pity that they don't have a language. Let's create one for them. So they took what Greek letters applied. They took what Latin letters applied. They took some from Hebrew, which they also knew. And they had to manufacture some, like for Shah, right? Okay. And they put a language together, and suffice it to say that the civilization really bloomed beginning 10th century, 11th century. Their inclination religiously was toward Constantinople at the time. And, they started to thrive as a civilization. When what happened? The Tatarskaya Iga, what they call a Tartar yoke, Genghis Khan and his folks came in from the east. Now, what, they come in and conquer? No, they came in and stayed for 220 years. That's what was ruling Russia for that time, okay? Now, finally, as the Russians got rid of those Genghis Khan folks, and started to get their act together under Ivan Grozny. Okay, Grozny means terrible. It means Grozny means threatening. Okay,
This is Ivan the Terrible?
Yeah, Ivan the Terrible, right? And those of you who've seen that movie from what's his name, Eisenstein or whatever, it's really very graphic. But what he was able to do is to gather the nobles, the boyars, all together and say, "Look, we're getting beat like hell from the east, and I worry about the west. So let's get together and form Muscovy. Let's form a Russian state." And he had a lot of trouble doing that. Why? Because then the Swedes from Sweden, and the Hanseatic League, Germans, and who else? The Lithuanians, all attacked Russia from the west. Now, it took them some years to get rid of them. They're still not real popular in Russia, the Swedes or the Lithuanians or the Germans, okay? But every Russian knows Russian history. And finally, when Peter the Great, Pyotr Veliki, finally, he's really an interesting guy. Did you know that as an 18-year-old, he insisted on working for 2 years on the wharves of Rotterdam in the Netherlands? Yeah, he wanted to find out what the West was really like, how it was ruled, how people treat each other. He came back, became king, Tsar, and he said, "Okay, we're going to look to the West. We had enough of those Orientals. Our future in Russia is to the West." And I have to say, parenthetically, that ever since then, 1700, we're talking about, Russian rulers, whether they were Soviet or just Russian, looked to the West to be accepted, to have a relatively peaceful existence with the West. Now, the Cold War included, because that was relatively peaceful compared to what we have now. Okay, let's update this thing, 1700. Well, I'll skip through Catherine the Great, who came after Peter and who was in power, I think, about 30 years during the time when the U.S. Revolution was happening. So that was the end of the 1700s. Well, what happened in 1812? Napoleon came in, right? How did he come in? Part of his forces came through the Ukraine. So the Russians had that experience, 1812. Finally pushed them back to Europe, 1815. The Russian officers that hung around in Paris for reasons anybody who knows Paris will understand, okay, they tasted a little bit of Western civilization too. And when they came back before the Tsarist palace, they demonstrated. What did they want? They wanted a constitution. And they had this fellow Constantine, who was all lined up to come in and be elected and have a constitution. So their cry was, "Constantine I Constitutia." Only problem was that 90% of the Russian people didn't know what Constitutia was. And so they got wrapped up. That was the first Russian Revolution, really get wrapped up and sent to Siberia. That was 1815. Okay, forward ahead a century, and you have the Nazis invading Russia. Okay, 1941. Now, the Russians had made a deal with the Nazis ahead of time, and that was a bit of self-preservation. They saw what was coming. They didn't see what was coming when the Nazis attacked them. When did the Nazis come through? Oh, well, they went to Leningrad and mounted a siege that lasted almost 900 days, mind you. 1 million people killed, including Putin's older brother. Okay. And then, of course, they came through that famous place, Ukraine. It's real easy to come through Ukraine. And who cooperated with them coming through Ukraine? Many Ukrainians under the banner of Stepan Bandera, he kind of created a unit under the SS, and there were thousands and thousands of people killed by the Banderites. And for some crazy reason, they happen to be heroes to a lot of the people running things in Ukraine today. So all I'm saying is that the Russians come out of this history where they're invaded from the east, they're invaded from the west, they get rid of that, oops, they're invaded from the west, up, then they're okay. So one would say that they're a little bit sensitive to being invaded. Okay. So if you fast forward, the Soviet Union falls apart. Berlin Wall falls 1989, November. What happens? East Europe is falling apart. The buffer zone that the Russians sort of worked out a deal at Yalta, so they always have this buffer zone against NATO, it disappears. And all these countries are resisting rule from the Soviets. Now, that was a good deal, but it was pretty, a good thing, but it was pretty unruly. So what does George H.W. Bush do? Now, I have to confess that I have a modicum of respect for George H.W. Bush, because I worked for him when he was head of the CIA directly, and then I briefed him every morning with the President's Daily Brief when he was vice president. I don't think he brought up his sons very well, but that's another, I mean, that's important. Couldn't be more important. But he had his head screwed on right. And so he gets on the phone with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was running the Soviet Union at the time. He said, Mikhail, we're not going to take advantage of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but things are going to hell in a teapot here in Eastern Europe. So we got to get together. How soon can you meet me? Gorbachev, a couple of weeks. Well, that was the middle of November. On December 1st, Bush, the first Bush, Elder Bush, and Gorbachev meet in Yalta. Now, I have not only book knowledge about this, I have knowledge from my good friend Jack Matlock, who was ambassador to the Soviet Union at the time, and with whom I worked very, very closely in the 70s to help put together the first arms control treaty, the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We from the intelligence side, he, of course, from the policy side. So Jack has told me what happened. He said, now Bush said again, look, we're not going to dance on the Berlin Wall. We need to figure out how to restructure these things. How soon can you see my Secretary of State, James Baker? And Gorbachev told me several weeks. Yeah, okay. So the 1st of February, 1990 now, Baker arrives in Moscow. Okay. And he talks with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, his foreign minister. And he says, look, I got a deal for you. He's a smart Texas lawyer. Actually, he was a damn good Secretary of State, but they don't all tell the truth, or some of them take liberties with what they say. So here's Baker. He says, look, we're like a reunited Germany. Now, maybe those of you that don't have any gray in their hair have no concept of how McGovern felt when he heard that this was being bandied about. I didn't want to read Germany. Maybe I saw too many war films when I was growing up. I was alive during all of World War II, okay? And I realized that the whole creation of NATO was to keep the Russians out, keep the US in, and keep Germany divided, for God's sake, down, okay? So if you can identify it all with how I felt, just think how Gorbachev and Shevardnadze felt, coming from a country that had suffered 26 million with an M, casualties, deaths during World War II. Not all of them soldiers, Soviet citizens, okay? By comparison, the US, I think we were soldiers, of course, 420,000, I think was how many killed. There's a big difference there, okay? So I can imagine how they felt about a reunited Germany. So they went home and mulled it over, came back the next day and said, well, where's the quo for this quid? you're asking us to swallow a really big quid. What quo can we expect from you? And I have this from Matlock, his baker. Well, he's from Texas. Okay, well, how it be? Yeah, I got it here. How it be if we promise not to move NATO 1 inch, that'll be about 2 centimeters for y'all, 1 inch east or toward you all in Russia. And well, long story short, Gorbachev and Shevardnadze decided to swallow this pill, the pill of a reunited Germany, in return for a promise. Now, I'm sure they said, well, it's a real promise, right? And Jim Big said, I cross my heart, hope to die. It's a promise. Okay. Well, we all know what happened to that promise, right? It wasn't written down. Now, Baker's a lawyer. He knew enough that it should have been written down. Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, they were too trusted. I had somebody on Gorbachev's team at the time. His name is Kuvaldin. He's a professor at University of Moscow now. He and I got together about 6 years ago in Moscow. I said, why wasn't that promise written down? And he looked at me and he said, well, you know, the ostensible reasons were that the Warsaw Pact still existed. I mean, there's still, you know, the treaty organization there. And we hadn't really gotten the Germans to buy into this yet. I mean, it did kind of affect the Germans. But he said the real reason was, he looked me straight in the face and he said, we trusted you. So, does George H.W. Bush keep the promise? Yeah, he does. Does Bill Clinton? Well, when they tell him that Bob Dole's doing pretty well in the Midwest, and there are an awful lot of Poles there, an awful lot of Hungarians and Czechs and Slovaks and so forth. You know, you might want to let those guys into NATO. And Clinton, long story short, against all the advice of all his, including George Kennan, for God's sake, who said that this would be a disastrous step. He decided, well, he let Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland into NATO. Matlock testified before Congress before that decision was made, and he repeated what Kennan and all the others said. This is a disaster. You don't need to do this. Why do you want to do this? And he was told afterwards, look, your arguments are very cogent from a strategic point of view. We'll probably pay the price for this, but Clinton wants to win the election, hands down. He'd made the decision, so you might as well forget about it. Just forget about it. Okay. So that's 1996, 1997. Okay. So before you know it, NATO has doubled in size. Okay. 14 new countries added, all of them more than 1 inch to the east of the East German border at the time. Okay. So that's happening up until the early 90s. And then what we hear is intimations that Ukraine and Georgia would like to be members of NATO. Okay. Well, what happened was when these rumors got really thick and furious, and there was going to be a NATO summit in Bucharest in April of 2008, on February 1st, 2008, our ambassador in Moscow, Bill Burns, was called to the foreign ministry. It was a new foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Okay, he's still foreign minister. Why was he called in? Well, here's what Lavrov said. Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? Yeah. "Niet" means "niet." Admission of Ukraine or Georgia into NATO is a red line for us strategically. We will have to react. There will be civil war in Ukraine, almost certainly. We will have to decide whether or not we have to intervene. It's not necessary. Tell your people, "niet" means "niet." Now, How do I know all that? Was Jack Matlock in Moscow at the time? No, he was long since gone. But we have the cable, the Moscow cable. It's from the embassy there. It's signed by Bill Burns, okay? And how do we have that? Well, WikiLeaks gave it to us. And, to his credit, I have to say that Burns played it straight. Ambassadors are allowed to comment in their cables. And he said, Russia has its own strategic interests. It's worried about its own backyard. And so now, why was that unusual? Because he's talking to Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney, for God's sake, and then Bush. And he knew that's not what they wanted to hear. That gives me some hope that Bill Burns, who's now CIA director, will be a good influence on the rising seniors now, rising juniors now that Biden has working for him. All right, so that's what happened in 2008. That was the 1st of February, that cable, that tete-a-tete between Lavrov and Burns. And 2 months later, on the 3rd of April, 2008, NATO declared Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Okay. Now that kind of stirred for a while, and then all of a sudden, in February of 2014, there was a coup in Kiev. This coup d'état, has been properly characterized as the most blatant coup in history. Now, why would they say that? Well, because it was advertised 18 days in advance on YouTube. You don't believe me? Well, what happened was this. Our Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, was talking to the US ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Pyatt, and she and he were planning the coup to the point where they're identifying who would be the next prime minister. His name was Yatsenyuk. Nuland called him Yats. Yats is the guy. He's got the experience. He can keep the Nazis a little bit to the side there, so we don't have to deal with that PR problem. And when Pyatt says, now the EU, that's a problem. They're not going to like this, Mrs. Secretary. And she says, well, F the EU. Now, I can't say that on a decent program, but the rest, the 4 letters in it.
Yes, that's a famous quote.
Yeah, F the EU, right. And so, oddly enough, one reason we know that intercepted conversations were authentic was not only the voices, but the fact that Victoria Nuland apologized to the EU. She said, oh, I didn't really mean to say the EU. She never apologized for the coup. The coup was brought off when Putin was in Sochi finishing up the Winter Olympics. He came back, had a council of war with his friends and said, well, they were already saying that Ukraine should join NATO. They're already banning Russian as an official language. What are we going to do? Well, the answer was clear. The strategic things come first, and we have to make sure they don't take our sole all-weather, ice-free naval base in Sevastopol, which happens to be in Crimea. I mean, that thing was liberated and set up by Catherine the Great herself. So this is centuries, and fought over. The Russians lost tens of thousands of people trying to take back Sevastopol from the Germans, the Nazi Germans. So they decided that, why is it? I mean, it's sort of an anomaly. Crimea used to be part of Russia proper. How did it get to be part of Ukraine? Well, it turns out that in 1954, after Stalin died, Khrushchev got it into his head that he needed a lot of support, green as he was. And what better than to get the Ukrainians on his side? I mean, he was born and raised a half mile from Ukraine, as I understand it. And so he gave this thing. What did he do? He took a piece of paper, right? and they did an ukaz. You know what an ukaz is? It's a kind of order that a Tsar or a party secretary can do. And all of a sudden, Crimea became part of Ukraine. Why did nobody notice? I mean, it's all the Soviet Union, right? I mean, doesn't matter if you're part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic or the Russian Soviet Republic. No, it was a distinction without a difference until this coup. Now, this coup caused Putin and his associates say, well, what do we do about Sevastopol? What do we do about the air bases we have in Crimea? What do we do about this incredibly strategic thing that juts out into the Black Sea? Well, we have to have it back. But somebody said, well, you know, what do the people in Crimea think? So unlike Khrushchev who did an ukaz, Putin is a good question. They're almost all Russian speakers. They would heavily favor. Well, yeah, they're already rebelling against the Ukrainian authorities, for God's sake. They would love to come back. Let's have a plebiscite. And so that's what they did. At a plebiscite, it came out, if the figures can be believed, 96% in favor of rejoining Russia. That's what happened. And they were folded into Russia at the time. Now, I will add this little footnote because it's really important. They were welcomed into Russia middle of March, and April 2014, Putin made a little speech, and he talked about, you know, reason that we were welcomed to Crimea into Russia proper is because not only because we're afraid that NATO would gobble it up, but we were afraid that NATO would put in strategic strike missiles in Crimea. He said, even more, we were worried about that. Now, this gets to the point of what the Russians are really afraid of. And that is that we, NATO, really the US, has put these so-called anti-ballistic missile sites in Romania and Poland. Romania, all finished. Poland's just about finished. And when Putin asked 7 years ago, what are these for? Why do you want ABM missiles there? I said, to defend against North Korea. No, not North Korea. Iran. Iran's going to get these missiles, nuclear missiles. And then, of course, there was the Iran agreement. And so Putin came back and said, well, wait a second now. The Iran agreement prevents the Iranians from having any missiles or not missiles, but nuclear warheads. So why are you still doing it? I said, oh, well, maybe Ukraine will get them at some time in the future. And Putin was livid. And he talked to Western correspondents about this. Some of you may have seen that clip. And so he said, you know, you can't really trust these guys because we know the Pentagon plans, how they modernize these ABM sites, how they put Tomahawk, where Putin says Tomahawk missiles, Tomahawk missiles in the same sort of site, and how they can do that by slipping in a little disk into the computer overnight and turn them into a threat to Russia's strategic forces in that part of Russia, the ICBM force. Now, they're in Poland. The capability is in Poland. It's in Romania. It's going to go into Poland. Now, something very interesting, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of, but at the very end of last year, remember they were planning US-Russian talks about these things. All of a sudden, what happened was on the 7th, I think it was December, Biden and Putin talked and set up this regime where they're going to talk in Geneva, 12th of January, I think. Putin wanted to do it right away, and to his credit, Biden accommodated that. But all of a sudden, it becomes very clear that Putin wants to talk to Biden before then. When? The 30th of December. Well, they get on the telephone. We don't know much from the US side, but the Russian readout said, and I quote, President Joseph Biden declared, the US has no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. That's in the Russian readout, okay? The Russians made a big thing of this from, in local media. You see it in US media, it's a major concession. What happened? As far as I can see, it disappeared. There was no mention of it during the negotiations that followed. So here's Putin. I'm Putin, right? And I'm saying, President of the United States promises me directly, one-to-one on the telephone, that there'll be no offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. And all of a sudden, it's off the board. What happened? And this is not the first time when a president of the United States, I refer explicitly to Obama, have made a promise directly to Putin, and it's gone the wayside very soon thereafter. Clearly, what happened, in my view, is that Biden woke up the next morning and his advisor said, "Did you really say that?" No, he said that. Come on, we need to keep those cards in our hand. So forget about it, Joe. Forget about it. And what do? We forget about it. Okay. So what I want to do is to say that this is a strategic problem, and that that the Russians are cleaning out that part of Ukraine so that no offensive strike missiles are going in there. And what happens to the ones in Poland and Romania? Well, that remains to be seen, but they know very well that they're targets of whatever Russian missiles are targeted against them. So let me just switch a little bit to say, well, that's the situation that faced Putin back last year. Now, to include China in this is really easy, because what's this? This is May, right? May 23rd.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Well, last June, June 16th, Biden and Putin got together at their first and only so far tete-a-tete one-on-one summit in Geneva. And we don't know much about what happened there. Putin was not really happy with it. We could tell from his press conference. And Biden, before he gets on the plane, he said, "I want to talk to the press." He said, "Come on, Joe, get on it." Joe, get it. No. This is what Biden says. It would be inappropriate to say exactly what I told Putin, but he's got a real problem. I tell you. The problem is China. China is squeezing him. China has this really thousands of mile border with Russia. Russia knows, Putin knows, that China wants not only to be the primary economic power, but primary military power. He's being squeezed. He's got this big problem. Okay, and they said, "Come on, Joe, get out of there." So he finally gets on the plane. Now, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when Putin turned to his advisors and said, "Huh? who the hell is telling Biden that the situation between us and China is the same way it was 50 years ago?" Maybe these smart Ivy League guys read a book about it, but it describes a situation when Russia and China were at loggerheads, hated each other. We analysts at the time thought they'd hate each other forever. Wrong. When you have a common enemy, you start to deal with one another. And then all of a sudden, according to Xi Jinping, the president of China, you become best friends. So suffice it to say that for the rest of the year, from June 16th right till the end of the year, Putin and Xi Jinping did everything they could to demonstrate how close they were, to the point of saying in December that their alliance exceeds a normal alliance, And then a crucial statement on the 4th of February, Putin's up in Beijing to launch the Winter Olympics. And they issue a statement saying, look, there's no end to the cooperation that we have. We can discuss anything. And besides, we think what NATO is doing in the West is not the right thing to do, okay? And the Chinese don't usually talk about things outside their own little territory, okay? So what happened? Well, by that time, the Russians' overtures to get a renegotiation of the order in Europe to prevent Ukraine from becoming part of NATO, and to get them to promise to be neutral or whatever, and then to take these other steps to reverse the trend where NATO kept moving closer and closer to Russia. Putin apparently saw that he couldn't trust the president of the United States, that whatever happened would be undermined by the next guy. I mean, the Trump or whoever. And so, in my view, now this is speculative. Everything I've said till now, fact. Okay, this is speculative. Here's Putin with Z in Beijing on the 4th of February. Now, President Z, it's really great that we're best friends and all. So I'm going to tell you that it's really hard. The West is not paying any attention. I can't trust Biden. We're going to have to go into Ukraine, likely as not. We're going to have to attack Ukraine. Z. You mean after the election? You mean after the Olympics, right? After the Olympics? Yeah, after the Olympics. End of discussion. Now, that's my idea of what kind of tacit encouragement or tacit nihil obstat Z gave Putin, but it was real. Now, my Chinese analyst colleagues do not agree with me on this because it means that China reversed its fundamental core principle of non-interference in the affairs of other countries. Okay, I mean, that's it. That's China, faithful to Westphalia, 1648 or whatever it was, right? Well, seems to me that President Z gave Putin a waiver on Westphalia. And I think the close Chinese support that Z has given Putin since then tends to corroborate my guess that this was approved in a tacit kind of way by Z. Otherwise, otherwise a lot of things. Otherwise, I believe that Putin would have been more reckless than I think he still is. I mean, I think the reckless going into Ukraine, but to do that alone without prior approval from Z, that would have been a real crazy man in my view. And the other thing is that, the Chinese, it's not so much that they have a love affair, Z and Putin. No. The Chinese are actually enemy number one. I mean, every 4-year document comes out of the Pentagon specifies that China is enemy number one. And these other, Russia doesn't make it at the top 4. Okay. I mean, hello, that's the way. So the Chinese know that if they finish Putin off, well, they're next. Okay. And so they have their own access, they have their own input here. Now, on the nuclear front, we know that Putin raised this early on. If memory serves, it was right after the invasion of Ukraine, where he read, we have nuclear weapons, don't forget that. Was that unusual? You're damn right that's unusual. Very rarely did any Russian or Soviet leader refer expressly or specifically to everyone knew it was in the background, but you don't go and say, we might use nuclear weapons. Putin did. So what does that mean? Well, it means that he takes this Ukraine thing very seriously. It means that he's willing to warn that if the West intervenes in a more dramatic way than it already has, he has this other option. How does the US react? Well, we, not that we're representative of the US, but we veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity issued a memo on the 1st of May, which said, look, Putin has made it clear that if NATO puts his back up against the wall, he will consider using nuclear weapons. He considers this to be an existential threat. And so, we're intelligence people. We're not going to try to tell you what to do, but please be aware, okay? What happens? 7 days later, or I guess it's 6 days later, the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, the fellow I mentioned before, tells a prominent newspaper, Putin interprets this as an existential threat. And so we have to be aware of that, crank that into our calculations. 3 days later, the 10th of May, Avril Haines, National Intelligence Director, testifies before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And she lays out this two-thirds of a syllogism. She says, we don't want any nuclear war. Second, if Putin faces defeat in Ukraine, this would be a factor weighing in favor of his waging nuclear war. We don't think offensive war, but maybe these small nukes, okay? Those are the two premises, okay? Don't want a nuclear war. Putin's gonna maybe use this. The risk is high if his back is against the wall. Now, the rest is a policy conclusion. We intelligence people don't tell what to do, but it should be pretty clear that the conclusion should be, therefore, for God's sake, realize what the stakes are in Ukraine. The stakes for everybody, using little small nukes is illusory. It'll always, get higher. But instead of that, the policy conclusion is we must defeat, we must have complete victory, as what did Nancy Pelosi and Schumer say against Russia. We gotta weaken them. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that for the first time ever, I've been through the whole Cold War, I started analyzing things 1964, if you can believe it. For the first time ever, we're really close to a risk of nuclear war if the two sides cannot decide on some sensible way to stop the killing of Ukrainians. And I, emphasize the adage, you kill up to the last Ukrainian. So what I'm saying is here, we should not only from a humanitarian point of view, but from a strategic point of view, we need to talk about these things. These things happen to be transcendently important. And the last thing I'll say is this, that, we talk about climate warming. We talk about the real risks that our grandchildren will inevitably face. And we talk about lost opportunities or opportunity costs. Okay, so opportunity, you build an F-35, well, you could finance 18 school districts for an F-35. Well, that's an opportunity cost. Well, the Ukraine war is the mother of all opportunity costs. Why? Because we don't have a lot of time. Is this likely to drag on? It is. Meanwhile, are we polluting? The armed forces are the biggest polluter in the world, and worst of all, we're distracting attention from a existential threat that faces us all. Even Avril Haines, the head of national intelligence, when she was rather new, her first testimony before Congress, even she said, "Look, the real problem is that we have to cooperate internationally to meet the climate change problem. It can't be done with any one state. It's got to be all of us. Ergo, you don't get involved in wars or almost wars, least of all nuclear wars, with the situation the way it is here now. So I've talked long enough for sure, and I'd be happy to. Well, let me ask you, Michael, to address this here because it's so relevant to our topic. There is this Russian-Chinese entente now. I'd call it an alliance in all but name. Now, the smart savants in Washington say, oh, those are Russians. They don't know what they're doing. You know, they're going to be swallowed up. They're going to be swallowed up by China. China's got 9 times the economy. China, they're going to be a gas station feeding China. China's going to just dominate them over the longer term. How can Putin be so stupid? What would you say to that, Michael?
Well, you have to look at China's history. China has a 5,000-year history. And in that 5,000 years, China has never dominated the world. China invented gunpowder. It was the first to invent gunpowder, and it had a monopoly on gunpowder for 400 years. This is at a time, during the Song Dynasty and some of these great dynasties, China had a large landmass, had a large population, had an advanced civilization, had good natural resources, and it had a 400-year monopoly on gunpowder. Yet it never went out and tried to conquer the world the way the West did when the West finally invented gunpowder. Why didn't China do that? Because China's philosophy, based on Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, which are the 3 main philosophies in ancient China, they always talked about a balance between yin and yang, between extremes. And they always felt that the best strategy for China was to secure its own borders and secure its own position, in Asia, and then just take care of itself and not get entangled in, far adventures trying to subjugate other countries, because from their point of view, that was an overextension that would exhaust their resources and in the end, hollow out the country and destroy the country. So they always considered far-flung foreign adventures of, conquest and that sort of thing as being ultimately self-destructive in the long term. The Chinese have always had a long-term view of things as compared to a short-term view of things. Western nations, if you think of the history of Europe, it's a bunch of small countries that have a long history of fighting each other almost constantly. So to them, war is something that is part of human life that you can't avoid. And they've always felt that going out and conquering other countries is something that people will always do. And if you don't want to be the victim, then you have to be the conqueror. That's called the zero-sum game. China has never played the zero-sum game. It's always viewed the zero-sum game as a crazy game that leads to one's ultimate self-destruction. So there's no reason to believe that China is going to do anything different now. The Chinese government talks about socialism with Chinese characteristics. What does Chinese characteristics mean? Well, they've revived Confucius, as somebody that you can study and learn from and should be respected. They revived, a lot of the ancient Chinese philosophies and wisdom, not that it supplants the socialist communist theory, but that it supplements it. So they're going back to the old strategy that China always had, which is to secure themselves and then trade with the rest of the world through the Silk Road, which they did in ancient times. And it's, the new name is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. They're basically recreating their old strategy. And the old Silk Road, people don't realize this, but it was not a means of manipulating or controlling or dominating other countries. It was a win-win strategy of simple trade, you know. They didn't go out at the point of a sword or a spear and force countries to trade with them. That means that whatever deals they cut, both sides had to agree to that. It had to be win-win, otherwise it wasn't a deal. It's as simple as that. And that's essentially what they're doing now. They're not going to be stupid enough. They've seen what happened to all the European colonial powers. They've seen that it's the same thing that happened to, you know, Genghis Khan and the Mongols and Alexander the Great and the Romans and all of these people before them. So they're not going to do that. They're going to do what they've always done. But the West is so convinced of the zero-sum game theory that they're convinced that anybody that rises to great economic power will then turn to military power and military conquest. They ignore all of China's 5,000-year history, and they project their own thinking onto China, and they say that's what the Chinese really think. That's not what the Chinese really think. Every nation is different. You know, China is not America. America is not Iraq. Iraq is not Afghanistan. You know, Africa is not Iraq. You know, each of these countries has a different history, a different culture, and a different view of life. And the elite in Washington today don't seem to understand that. And therefore, they project their own mentality over to everybody else. And that's where they fundamentally go wrong. You know, Hillary Clinton said, I don't want my grandchildren to grow up in a world dominated by the Chinese. That's her projection. That's what she thinks. She hasn't taken the time to really study Chinese history or understand how the Chinese actually think and what the Chinese strategy actually is. The Americans perceive China, Russia, Iran, you know, all of these different countries as existential threats. You know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, they had the project for the new American century, and they came up with the theory that they want to prevent any country from ever rising to a powerful position where they can challenge the United States the way the Soviet Union did. That's a very narrow-minded philosophy. They need to have a more realistic view of other peoples, other cultures, and other countries. So that's my take on it.
Michael, thanks very much for that. You know, a lot of things come to mind here. You've clearly studied this. Why is it that no Chinese academicians, I mean, when I talk about Chinese, I mean US academicians who are expert in China or policy people, why is it that they're all zero sum and don't seem to either understand what you just said or want to just kind of prescind from it and go ahead in their merry way to dominate everyone? It has to be, I mean, I can account for what happened to people doing Soviet studies since the wall fell. That's a disaster. The universities are awful on that. I'd be interested in your views on why the people at the National Security Council, or the people traveling around there with Biden now out in the Far East, why they don't seem to grasp this basic nature of Chinese civilization.
It's very strange. I've seen so many American and Western academics who actually lived in China, you know, learn the language, speaks it fluently, you know, reads and writes Chinese, and spent decades in China. But they still, for whatever reason, can't seem to get past the original stereotypes that they grew up with. And they're so caught up in their own paradigms, their own American paradigms, that they still, to this day, see China through an American lens. And that's a problem. They can't get past that. You know, there's one person, I won't name his name, but he said that he wrote this in public, in a publication. And he's a fairly well-known American China expert. He said, as individuals, the Chinese have no friends. And as a nation, China has no friends either. Now that's just crazy. You know, I'm sorry, that's just crazy. You know, and you get people like Brigadier General John Olson of the US Space Force, who said that China is not only seeking global domination, they're seeking, quote, galactic domination. Galactic, the galaxy, you know. We're talking about 100 billion with a B stars. You know, I guarantee you, China cannot and is not interested in dominating the galaxy. You know, we'd be lucky if the entire human race went out there and tried to dominate the galaxy. We'd be lucky not to get our butt kicked by some, you know, much more advanced race out there. So people are making just these totally extreme statements that are completely wild, completely unrealistic, but they talk about them as if they actually believe what they're saying. And, you know, I'm inclined to think they do believe what they're saying. That's what worries me.
That's what worries me too. You know, I mean, I have a little anecdote that is apocryphal. It has to do with Jake Sullivan, and you know why he's losing his hair up in the front of his head here, and that's because when you tell them the answer to a very simple question, or when he asks a very simple question, or somebody, let me get this right here. When he asks a simple question like, do all Chinese look alike? And he hears the answer, no, that's not true. You have to go look at some Chinese. Then he goes, oh, that's right. Yeah, okay. So, I'm sorry. I really screwed that joke up. First he says, I don't know. And then he says, oh, that's right. So, you know, I don't understand it either. Now, I do, you know, try to, as you do, Michael, put yourself in the position of Chinese leaders or Russian leaders. And, you know, I come out of the era when I made a living reporting on how hateful they were to one another, you know, shooting across the border and massing divisions on the border and, you know, being rivals to head up the international communist movement such as it was in those days. I mean, it came to the point where the Chinese were blocking the flow of Russian supplies to Vietnam, okay? I mean, hello, why? Was it their first duty to defend a fellow socialist country? No, their first duty was hate the Russians, not give them any credit for helping Vietnam. So the hate was very, very, very strong. And what I'm saying now is simply that that's all changed. And they used to call each other great power chauvinists, okay? I mean, there were rhetorical flourishes here, but the Russians and the Chinese exchanged these you're a great power chauvinist, you're a great power chauvinist, okay? Now they found out that, you know, there is a great power chauvinist, and it's not you and it's not me.
It's right here at home.
It's right here, yeah. So this whole thing, Putin has declared himself on this, and this is kind of interesting. And maybe you have some parallels from the Chinese side. Back in the heyday of US-Russian cooperation, only lasted a month. It was in August, September 2013. Obama, I don't know what got into him, but he decided to do as a sensible thing, the constitutional thing, and consult Congress before he made open war on Syria. But he had the problem of these Syrian chemical weapons. So he goes up to St. Petersburg, he meets with Putin. He says, I got a solution to your problem. Let's have the Syrians destroy all their chemical weapons. And Obama said, huh? You can do that? Yeah, we can do it. We persuaded them. And we destroyed them under UN supervision. You have some ships specifically outfitted to do that. Can we use one of your ships? Yeah, okay. Now, Obama's chestnuts were pulled out of the fire. He didn't have to bow to these crazies that really wanted an overt war against Syria for Israel as much as for anyone else, okay? And so that was the heyday. So what did Putin do? Right in the middle of all this, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. New York Times. The date was September 11th, 2013. September 11th is just a coincidence. And what he said at the end, and I was reliably informed later, and more proof came later, that he penned this himself. He said, I really value the increase in trust between the President of the United States and me and our countries at large. I only have one problem, and that is the idea that the US is an exceptional power. President Biden and President Obama said that just last week in a major speech. I disagree. I think all nations are at different levels of development. Some are closer to democracy, some farther away. But when God looks down at the nations of the world, he sees them all as equal, period, end quote. Well, why do I say confirmation came? 2 years later, he's asked to say some question like that relates to this in an impromptu interview, and he repeats this almost verbatim. So, one can assume, as I do, that this US concept of being indispensable or exceptional jars with these other states. But why the hell does the US get off being exceptional? Okay. And he said it. Okay. So when China and Russia look at the United States and say, oh, these are these exceptional guys, they think they can threaten us on both fronts. Well, let's make sure that they understand that they're taking on both of us. And if they want a two-front war or open hostilities on two fronts, well, that's a possibility now because our relationship exceeds a normal alliance and there is no end to our cooperation. How much clearer can the two countries make it? And yet you have Jake Sullivan and Blinken and Nod and everybody else running around because they have a law degree from an Ivy school thinking that they know better, that somehow or other the US can arrange things. Now, one thing I'll also relate because it sticks in my craw. John Kerry, he was an exceptional guy for sure. He was great on Vietnam, but he fell in with the wrong crowd. He became Secretary of State. And to his credit, Obama told him, you negotiate a ceasefire about Syria, okay? Do it with Lavrov. Dealt with him. He can make it work. You do it together. Now, they spent 11 months working it out, okay? And they concluded it with specific chop or endorsement by Putin and by Obama. It took the US Air Force 5 days to violate that ceasefire and bomb the hell out of Syrian forces that had been in place in those places for many months. So it was not a mistake of any kind. Putin at the next little Valdai conferences, I don't know what to make of this. I work out an agreement with the President of the United States for this ceasefire, And then apparently not everybody in Washington agrees with the president and subverts it, and we have continual war. I just don't understand. Well, the point of my thing is that here's Kerry, 2 days after the ceasefire falls apart, he's talking at an Atlantic Council sponsored meeting in Washington, big theater and all. I wangled the ticket. Okay, I'm sitting there, and the first question Kerry's asked is, now, Secretary Kerry, how did you think you could get a ceasefire to stick in Syria, given? And Kerry says, you know, I have to tell you, this was a most formidable problem I've faced in my entire professional career. You have Sunnis against Shia, you have Kurds against Kurds, you got Syrians, you got Turks, you got Russians, you got the. It was just, it just wasn't possible to align all these forces. Well, who the hell told you that you could align all these forces, Kerry? You know, well, something he learned at Yale or Harvard or something. Well, of course you can align all these forces. We've always aligned these forces, you know. So this is the kind of dominant notion that these people have. And the sooner they get rid of it, the better. But meanwhile, we're forced to be at the tender mercies of people who have Biden's ear. And Biden, and this is a biggie right now, you know that Biden said just yesterday, or it's today, I guess, or yesterday, Japan time, you know, we have a commitment. We will defend Taiwan if there are hostilities there. Well, my God, if there's anything Biden should know is that we have no commitment. You know, it's not likely, in my view, that the Chinese are going to attack Taiwan anytime soon. But if they do, there's a specific non-commitment recognizing the fact that Taiwan is part of China. So here's Biden making what people call a faux pas. Well, I don't care if it's a faux pas or not. This is the fourth time he's made that faux pas. And here I am in Beijing, I'm Xi Jinping, and I'm saying, now, wait a second. What are we to make of this? 4 times? Are you trying to give us some kind of a signal here? Or do they really need to double the size of the 7th Fleet? Is that what this is all about? The Mickey Mat, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia think tank complex, the Mickey Mat? Is that what I mean, or what? So, you know, it's not a stretch to think that the leaders in Beijing and the leaders in Moscow will be saying, well, you know, we have a president who doesn't seem to know which end is up and which button to press, perhaps. So who's calling the shots in Washington? I mean, is it the likes of rising seniors like Biden and Sullivan, who come out of this dominant indispensable context where Madeleine Albright is honored for doing what she did? It is. And so they have to reason with that, and they have to be prepared. And they've decided that they have to be prepared militarily as well. And so, you know, if Biden has a backup, if Putin has his back up against the wall in Ukraine, I don't think he's going to resort to nuclear weapons in the first case. He's going to resort to his old friend Xi Jinping, and he's going to say, the Americans have to realize that we really are together. Stir up a little trouble in the South China Sea, or fly 50 rather than just 29 fighters and bombers through the Taiwan Straits. Now, that's my view as a Russian analyst. I'd be interested, Michael, is to hear you comment on, let's say Putin is losing, is facing a loss in Ukraine. Would he turn to Xi? And if so, how would Xi react?
Actually, let me talk a little bit more about the situation in Taiwan before I answer that question, because that background is significant to that question. So as you've mentioned, Biden has been upping the ante in Taiwan. He's, now done away with strategic ambiguity and come out and said that the United States will, in fact, defend Taiwan, which could mean bringing American forces to Taiwan. The other thing he's done is they just had an election in South Korea, and a very right-wing president has been elected, extremely right-wing, and we have a right-wing prime minister in Japan. And both of those people have now said that if something happens on Taiwan, that they will get involved. So that's a significant escalation. Also, the Shanghai Communique, which was signed by Nixon and Mao back in 50 years ago when they had the opening to China, established the basic rules for the Chinese-US relationship. And one of those rules is that they respect each other's sovereignty and that Taiwan is a part of China. There is only one China. And that meant that we cut official relations with Taiwan, and we have now unofficial relations. But recently the Biden administration has been sending more and more US officials officially to visit Taiwan. We've done things like land military planes in Taiwan, have them take off and then patrol the Chinese coast, which means we're doing an operation from Taiwan, military operation. We've also acknowledged publicly that we've had US military trainers in Taiwan training the Taiwan military, which means a direct military to military relationship, which is an official relationship. We've been running carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Straits as well as the South China Sea. Now, freedom of navigation might be running a destroyer or a cruiser up through there every once in a while. That's freedom of navigation. Running carrier battle groups is a lot more than freedom of navigation. This is intimidation. This is threatening. And we say that, oh, look, it's international waters. We have the right to do all this. Sure, the law may say that, but, is China running carrier battle groups off our coast? No. So, clearly we're the ones threatening them, and yet we're saying they're threatening us, which is the reverse of reality. And what this is all moving towards is step by step, we're eroding the one China policy, even though the Taiwan government, its official name is Republic of China. Its national airlines is China Airlines. Its official language is Mandarin. It claims all of China as its governing territory because it was at one point the government of China. And the Shanghai Communique made 50 years ago, which has kept the peace for 50 years, says very clearly that the issues between Taiwan and the mainland are to be settled by the Chinese people themselves. Doesn't say how. And Biden is now saying that means peacefully. No, that's not what it said. It just said between them. It didn't say how. So if China sees that, and China has long said that if Taiwan declares independence, that's a red line, and they will feel justified in using force. They haven't said that they will use force, but that would be justification. We're pushing up against that red line very strongly. And we've been doing it step by step, just in the same way that, we enlarged NATO step by step, and then we came out of the medium and short range ballistic missile treaty, and that means that now we're saying that we might place missiles in, places like Ukraine if it became part of NATO that could hit Moscow in a matter of minutes. So we're doing the same thing, both in Europe and in Asia. And that's a very big threat. A lot of American analysts are saying that China is looking to what's happening in Ukraine and thinking about what they want to do on the basis of that. What China's actually saying is they're looking at the question of independence of Taiwan. For us to say that we're going to defend Taiwan and and help Taiwan to break away from China and no longer be a province of China is equivalent to if China or Russia or any other country were to say, we support Hawaiian independence, we will fight to help Hawaii break away from the United States. Hawaii has been, a state of the United States that happened in my lifetime, less than, I'm 74 right now, I'll be 75 in, a couple of months. Taiwan has been part of China since the Qing dynasty, which started in 1644. So, for us to say that we're going to take Taiwan away from China and so it's no longer a province of China, we need to understand that's equivalent to China saying they're going to take Hawaii away from us and have it be an independent country. So I think that's more critical than the relationship with Ukraine. For example, if Russia were to start losing in Ukraine and they turn to China for help, China's had this relationship with both Russia and Ukraine for quite some time now, where they were friends with both of them. They were buying grain from Ukraine as well as Russia. And during this war, China abstained on the vote at the UN. They're not participating in the sanctions, the US sanctions against Russia, but neither is, a majority of countries in the world. India's not, for example. A lot of the Asian and Middle Eastern and Latin American and African countries are not either. There's actually only a minority of countries, mostly the West and its allies, that are participating in the sanctions against the war, against Russia. So China's not participating in the sanctions against Russia, but it did also send humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So if Russia were to start losing, China can't really help Russia militarily. I mean, they've talked about, well, would China send weapons to Russia? Well, the Russian weapons, unlike the NATO weapons, are not interchangeable. They're, even their rifles are different caliber rifles. And sending a bunch of high-tech equipment from China to Russia with, instructions in Chinese, I don't know how effective that would be. Russians might have a little problem trying to read Chinese. So I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see that as a probability. What I see is that China would try to step in diplomatically and negotiate some kind of peace deal. The problem with that is if the United States is not in favor of it, the Ukrainians would probably not go along with it. And in that case, I could see this war just grinding on and becoming kind of like, the forever war that we just got out of in Afghanistan. I don't see the Russians, regardless of how things go on the battlefield, I don't see the Russians giving up, nor do I see the Ukrainians giving up. So there's two things that worry me about Ukraine. One is that it could be another forever war. But the worst thing that bothers me about Ukraine is that it could turn nuclear, just as you've described. And I have a question for you, actually. We talked about the zero-sum game and how China has a totally different mentality. It's never played the zero-sum game. What's the Russian culture and philosophy and history with the concept of the zero-sum game? Is this something that Russia believes in, or do they have a different take on that, a different mentality? What's your impression?
Well, I think I would refer back to what Putin wrote in that op-ed in the New York Times. I think that he's offended by not being taken seriously, that he's warned about this for the entire time he's been in charge of Russia, and that there is this super attitude on the part of the US where they don't have to take his legitimate concerns for Russia's own security seriously. So I would say that the Russian attitude is much closer to the Chinese attitude, and that the US is just unable to get out from under this notion that we are the city on the hill, that everybody else is a potential threat. I mean, why can't we just get along? That's what the Chinese are saying, you know?
Exactly.
Win-win. It is possible to do a win-win. So that's really very troubling, because if Americans kind of buy all the propaganda to which we've been subjected, the Russians have been blackened. 5 years of Russiagate on the basis of a bunch of lies, bald-faced lies, and that's coming out in court now, okay? Some of Hillary Clinton's fancy lawyers lied to the FBI. The whole thing is being washed out in court. They were lies, but people, ask 80% of the American people, Russia. You know, what could be worse? I'll share with you a little bit my prejudices here. If I wanted to accuse someone of a really heinous crime, I mean, what could be worse than saying this person is responsible for 4 years of Donald Trump? I mean, that's what they say Putin was. You know, he interfered with. Well, the people who interfered with the election were Hillary Clinton and her crowd. They tried desperately to win, and then when they didn't win, they did everything they could to emasculate Trump and make it impossible for him to do anything constructive, to include reconstruct a decent relationship with Russia. So this is the problem. Americans don't have any idea of the kinds of things that we're talking about. You should go on a lot of cable TV, Michael, and say the kinds of things that you have. And, you know, I kid
They would
you
never
not,
allow
I
me
mean,
to be on public TV if I'm going to say those kinds of things. By the way, we're at an hour and 25 minutes. Do you want to talk for another 5 minutes and kind of wrap up?
Sure.
Or
Yeah.
do you want to go on for longer than an hour and a half?
Well, I'll defer to you on this, Michael, but I would say this, that my favorite principle is something called the Noah principle. I think you know of it. Like Noah from the Bible, you know. No more awards for predicting rain. Awards only for building arcs. Now, the rain that we predict just now is that we'll never be able to make it into the mainstream media to tell the truth to our fellow citizens. We keep saying that, and of course, it's all too true. But we have to be smart enough, I think, as a collective, to figure out ways to do that, to figure out ways to get to our fellow citizens. I learned stuff from talking to you, Michael, about China, a lot of good stuff.
Oh, thanks.
My fellow
I learned
Americans
a lot from you about Russia.
Well, you know, we've been through it. You know, you have lots of reason to be up on this. So do I. I've been watching this for 6 decades, if you could believe it. So the trick is, how do we build an arc? You know, we complain about not being able to get in the media. Well, I hope that somebody watching this, or somebody who will watch it, will say, you know, I know how to get Michael Wong on CNN or on BSNBC or whatever, or I know how to get him before the student body in this university. I mean, we all have our access to various parts of what I call the Mickey Mat, and I'll say it once again: the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Now, the reason I say media is because it's the crux, it's the crucible, it's the cornerstone. Without the media, the Mickey Mat doesn't work. And who owns the media? Who controls the media? The rest of the Mickey Mat, of course. So that's the way it is. But and I'm not trying to be critical at all, but I think we have to be open to the suggestion that the fault is not in our stars, but in ourselves. And that, it's really crucial at this time and place to put our heads together and do stuff that we haven't thought about before, maybe putting our bodies into it, but some stuff that other Americans can look at and say, my God, these guys know something about what's going on. And they're willing to make some sacrifices to tell the rest of us which end is up. We don't need forever war. We know what that's like. We know what this is all based on, and it's greed, and it's these CEOs of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon who are making hand over fist out of tension, like in Ukraine and the South China Sea. So I guess I confess to some frustration because I've been trying to do this for 18 years now, ever since before Iraq. 19 years, I guess. What I'm saying is that we need to keep trying, that we can't expect immediate success. And it's not about results. It's about being faithful to our job, to spread the word around. And I truly think, Michael, that you should have some friends that promote you and get you on so that you can just say the things you just said here today, which are, which are not new to me because you told me them before, but new to others. And the whole conundrum about why people who know China fall into this great power chauvinism idea that we Americans are exceptional or indispensable. I mean, can't you know a country? Can't you know Putin without marrying him, but at least understanding him? Well, that was been my job, try to understand Putin. Last thing I'll say on that is I spent a lot of time in Germany. I lived there for 5 years, and I go back, and when I lecture there, or this was about 6 years ago, there's this little button on a guy's lapel that said, Putin verstehe. Verstehen is to understand. So Putin, a person who understands Putin. And I looked and I said to a friend, what's that? What's that all about? Is this good? I mean, somebody understands Putin? And he says, well, in this little milieu, it's okay. But to be a Putin versteher is to be a traitor, somebody who's just against our Western ethos in the broader society. So I don't have my pen with me, but Putin versteher is what we need to be, for God's sake. And it shouldn't be a pejorative. And I dare say that these young people that Biden has around him don't have a chance of understanding a guy who's trying to defend this country against people who consider themselves indispensable or exceptional and able and willing to do what it takes to dominate the world.
I could say the same thing for Xi as well, Xi Jinping.
You could say what?
I could say the same thing for Xi Jinping. If you actually read what he's written, you get a completely different picture of him than if you listen to the mainstream media. You know, I mean, he talks about governing the country. He talks about international relationships, and he talks about win-win and how either humanity will survive together or we'll all die together. You know, he talks about humanity as a community of common destiny, which, you know, is the fact. You know, either we will all live together or we will all die together. Those are our choices.
That's what Dr. King said in a very pithy way as well. Yeah. And I guess the key is, at least from my perspective, and you know, I love Dr. King, and I use his letter from the Birmingham City Jail in any course that I teach, even if it's geometry, you know. But I remember one particular group of sentences that go together well, and that not many people are aware of from that letter. I'd like to recite them now because it reflects where I'm coming from, where I think you're coming from. He talked about injustice and lies, okay? And he says this: like a boil that can never be cured unless it is opened up with all its pus-flowing ugliness to the natural remedies of air and light, so too injustice must be exposed with all the friction its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. So there's a lot of injustice and a lot of sin and a lot of just what's the word? The grasping for more and more for these CEOs. The military-industrial complex is exactly what President Eisenhower warned about. What was it, 60 years ago now? Okay, or more, 70, whatever it is. It was 61, I think, right? You do the math. It's expanded. And last thing I'll say on that, it goes in with the quote, is that Eisenhower was smart enough to say, the only defense against the accretion of power, wanted or unwanted, it's wanted, we know, by the military-industrial complex, is a well-informed citizenry, okay? And that's what we ain't got. We ain't got a well-informed citizenry. And I guess we open up the boil and let all that pus-flowing ugliness flow out and tell the truth to as many American co-citizens as we can, then it's not going to get any better anytime soon. So I welcome the opportunity, and thanks for inviting me, Michael, to be with you and to share your thoughts as well as mine with, I hope, a bunch of folks that will send them around to people who might not have heard some of the things that we've articulated here. Thanks again.
Thank you. That sounds like a great closing note. So thank you to our audience, and we'll close as soon as I can figure out how to do this. Let's see. Okay. Oh, here we go.